Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. This evening we're going to be talking about the defence diversification and the arms trade, and we've got three guests, or at least we're hoping to have three guests. One of them has not been able to join us yet because of technical difficulties to discuss this issue. We have David Gannon, who's not been able to log on just yet, but David is somebody who served in the British Army in Afghanistan and is now an anti-war activist. He's a founding member of the Socialist Veterans Association and a member of Veterans for Peace. Kate Hudson, many people will know, is a long-standing peace and anti-war activist, and she's been the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament for the last 10 years. And our final guest is Hilary Wainwright, who's an academic, and amongst her many achievements, she's a founding editor of the Red Pepper magazine and has been doing quite a bit of work in relation to defence diversification, along with a number of other experts. And I wonder if I could perhaps just start with you, Hilary, in terms of that work that you've been doing in relation to defence diversification, particularly in terms of how we respond to the pandemic now. And I think you've been talking about how we can use some of that technology, for example, to ensure that the NHS is properly kitted up and prepared and able to, respond to the challenges that have been posed by COVID-19. Well, you could talk about that and perhaps just a little bit more widely in relation to the work that you've been doing on defence diversification with the other experts that have been working on this topic.
Yes, okay. So, I mean, my involvement in defence diversification goes back to the 70s, when, in a way, the key experts were actually the shop stewards and the workers in defence production. And that's one of the key things I learned, that actually defence diversification must start with the knowledge and the recognition of the knowledge of the skilled workers, highly skilled designers on whom the defence systems depend. So my first involvement, I'll be very brief, was with Vickers Engineering on Tyneside, where they were making tanks. And the workers that were being faced with redundancies, and although they in the past often lobbied the Ministry of Defence for more orders for tanks, many of them were in CND, the organisation that Kate's the General Secretary of, and they began to feel uneasy about demanding more tanks, weapons of destruction, and instead they started thinking about what else they could do. And then that led to connections with the very famous and inspiring experience of Lucas Aerospace workers, who, again, faced with redundancies. And I think the general point here is that when people are faced with a shock in the old system, they begin to think in new ways, and they look to their own capacities. And these workers, which included some of the best designers in the world, making very complex aerospace components, making missiles too. They began to think, well, actually, look at the problems around the world, climate change. It was even, an issue then, the need for energy conservation, the need for better transport systems, particularly in the third world, need for medical equipment, another issue now. And they began to think, well, let's refuse the idea that we're redundant. Our skills are not redundant. That's the employers, that's the bosses that are saying we're redundant. We actually know that our skills could be useful, socially useful. And so they drew up a plan which was known as the Alternative Corporate Plan, that's to management's plan, for socially useful production. Now in this pandemic, we've been in a situation which is extraordinary, where actually socially useful considerations have had to dominate the economy. I mean, Johnson and his present government didn't want that. I mean, they were doing their best, delaying the lockdown in spite of the deaths that were being caused, because they wanted to keep an economy for profit going, when in the end they had to submit to the idea that the overriding need was health. And so you got even them calling for aerospace industries to convert to making ventilators, because they starved the the NHS, but the equipment was desperately needed. So actually, you got, for example, in Airbus, you got the company agreeing, and then the unions putting all their organisation and their skill into developing models for ventilators, working with smaller companies that didn't have the capacity but had the knowledge to produce the ventilators. And so I did a little mini. I'm sort of ever on the lookout for examples of diversification that kind of prove the point that it's possible. You can't say, oh, it's not possible. It is. It's possible. The workers have the knowledge. The companies have the machinery, and it's just a matter of the will and the balance of power being in favour of socially useful production. So there, in this North Wales Airbus company, the workers got organised, used their existing health and safety systems representatives to create a sterile environment for the production of ventilators. And I think that, just briefly to finish up on the relevance of all that, I think that shows that now, when we're faced with mass redundancies because the airline market is declining, and in some ways that's a good thing, not the redundancies and the unemployment, but the fact that aerospace is facing a crisis means this is an opportunity for a green investment program. And a part of that would be a massive, it would need a massive investment in the NHS, in re-equipping the NHS, knowing, what's been revealed during the crisis, that, the ventilators, kidney machines, because COVID causes massive kidney problems, all sorts of really important but basic equipment is needed. And the same skills, the same workers, the same productive capacity that now is making airlines, or more significantly for this discussion, actual military production, could be converted without it, quite easily to production of medical equipment. So but the key point is that it does involve the unions. And the other thing that we'll probably come on to, that we've learned through the crisis, is that the unions are able to think about themselves and their members as not just workers fighting for work, wages and conditions, but actually as citizens concerned with the interests of the wider public. So, the teachers' union was the best example of this, that fought for the delay in the opening of schools, not just because of their own members, though that was important, but because of the impact on the community, on parents. So I think now is an opportunity. So it's really good to be having this discussion.
No, thanks very much, Dave, for that. I mean, I think certainly the Lucas Plan from 1976, so the year that I actually joined the Labour Party, is an inspirational piece of work. It's something that I've referenced on this programme previously, actually. And so it's good to have somebody who's got kind of hands-on experience of kind of working with some of the people who were involved in producing that. And just before this programme, or today, as I was preparing for tonight's broadcast, I've just kind of going through some of my old archives, and I came across this document. I don't know if you can see it here. This is something that was produced by the Workers' Union, Arms Jobs Conversion. So I think it is, as you say, Hilary, crucially important that we do get the trade unions on side, because understandably, and certainly in my city where I live in Derby, some of the workers at Rolls-Royce are involved in the arms industry, and understandably, the unions are concerned about the implications of moving away from defence expenditure because of the consequences for jobs, etc. But I know that when Jeremy was standing for leader and he was making his case for getting rid of Trident, for example, that some work had been done, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with this, Kate, as well, that actually there is no need for, and indeed nobody's arguing for anybody working in a highly skilled, well-paid occupation to lose their employment. It's really about ensuring that we maintain those skills. And if anything, actually, and I think CND did some work on this, Kate, and you might want to comment on this, that the number of high-skilled, high-tech jobs, if those skills were transferred into socially useful production, could actually generate more jobs than what are being deployed, for example, on producing Trident now. And if you perhaps could say something about that, Kate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely fundamental. And just going back to the question about getting the unions on side, in actual fact, this is something that the TUC itself has been pressing for a number of years. So in 2017, the TUC Congress passed a resolution calling on Labour, as they in opposition, to set up a shadow defence diversification agency, so that they would, as Jeremy had previously commented on a couple of years before, to get those plans in place. How will they diversify away from arms, away from, say, nuclear weapons production, into socially useful production? And in particular, things like sustainable energy production, housing, a whole range of things. We did a very detailed study about the number of jobs that could be produced in, jobs that would be produced in housing if the money spent on Trident, or some of it at least, were to be spent on a house building programme. And it was just many, many, many times the number of jobs actually coming from the Trident submarine programme. I think there are 11,500 jobs directly related to that. And unions have done studies which show that you could have 100,000 jobs or so in sustainable energy production instead for the same amount of money, if not more, depending on where you make that socially useful investment. So the TUC in 2017 passed this motion. They asked Labour, therefore, to set up this Defence Diversification Agency shadow while they were in opposition, so the unions could get together with industry and with the Labour Party and all the relevant bodies. The workers would have a good role in that, proper role in that, and get that process started, so that when they were hopefully to come into government, they'd be hitting the ground running, and that could be part of their industrial policy and part of reviving and regenerating the UK economy. And unfortunately, Labour never took that up. There were some discussions and so on, but they never set up a shadow defence diversification agency. And I think that was an enormous opportunity that was lost, because now trying to get the Tories to do that, in spite of the fact that, as Hilary said, we've seen some very successful examples of defence diversification during the pandemic with the UK Ventilator Challenge and all kinds of other products being produced. They'll just want to go back to the same old thing. So just for using Barrow as an example, which is where the Trident subs are produced, the BAE Systems, which runs the site there, they were part of the UK Ventilator Challenge. And other things that were being produced there was screens to go between hospital beds, clips for hanging, curtains and things for opening doors safely, all kinds of PPE. And some of the workers there were volunteering to work on that production. They were printing visors from home with 3D printers. It's a phenomenal effort. But unfortunately now, since the 5th of July, because they'd produced their over 13,000 ventilators, they've gone back to normal production. So that's an opportunity lost. But I think we have to recognise that the trade unions, and I've spoken to many workers from Barrow in the past, they've come to C&D fringe meetings at TUC to put forward their view. They would rather produce something other than weapons of mass destruction. And Hilary gave an example of kidney dialysis machines, which is one that they know they could easily produce instead. So we need to really keep that argument going and really regenerate that argument, because we've seen over the past few months how effective that can be.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a series of missed opportunities, it seems to me, Kate, in relation to defence diversification. I mean, going back, there may have been any things before Lucas, but Lucas is the one I'm most familiar with back in 1976, as we've already referenced, and that wasn't taken forward. And I believe they came up with about 150 alternative socially useful products, including wind turbines and solar panels, and
many of which vehicles subsequently being produced.
This call, although it's not been taken forward yet, I think is absolutely essential that we continue to press for it and build, support for it and raise consciousness in that sense. But obviously, the military-industrial complex is incredibly influential, has a lot of power. It's an incredibly profitable industry. And I wonder if I could just bring David in now, who's managed to join us, because David served on the front line. He's been in Afghanistan, as I was saying. You missed it, David, before you arrived. I just gave you your introduction. And but David, yes, I mean, he's served on the front line. And I just wonder perhaps if you could give us your take, Dave, because I mean, you are now very active in as a peace activist. In terms of what your thoughts are in relation to the influence of the arms industry, the military-industrial complex, because yes, it makes lots of profits for these faceless corporations, but it's the poor bloody infantry people like yourself that pay the price, potentially ultimate price, and of course the consequences and implications for civilians on the ground with the imperialist wars that Britain's been engaged in, really, virtually every decade since the end of the Second World War. What's your take on this issue, David? And welcome to you, by the way.
Well, I mean, oh yeah, hi everybody. I was when I was in Afghanistan, I was an engineer. And the front line, because Afghanistan's quite weird, really. And a lot of people it's not necessarily a shooting war. For me, it wasn't. I was like an engineering expert, and I basically built things. And there's times when I was doing my job when you could have just got exploded. There's no real sort of way to actually aim at anyone because of the IEDs. It's different. Yeah. By the time I actually got shot at, I didn't really care about it, to be fair, because it's just they're not very good at shooting. And that sounds ridiculous, but it's true. So the military industrial complex itself is basically the end phase of free market economics. It's when you have everything's about profit and nothing else, and ethics has got nothing to do with it. Inevitably, it comes into monetizing life and death because they're things that people will pay for. So whereas you have the NHS, that's basically it's alternative to the medical industrial complex, and you've got that, especially with the pharmaceutical industry, and that you have that over in the States where it's fully in play. But I mean, it's pretty much in play here sort of now anyway, to be fair, and it's looking more inevitable that we're going to privatize everything. What happened though with the MOD and with the military is that they privatized things a lot sooner, and there was nobody on the left or the trade unions actually trying to stop it, because to be honest, I don't think they actually really cared about the guys in the military, if I'm honest. They didn't see it, so why would you care about it? Loads of things have been how would I best put it? Defense diversification. You're never going to get defense diversification whilst you have a publicly owned, whilst you have a privately owned, profit-driven weapons industry. It's never going to happen, right? And our tactics towards anti-war and our strategy towards the anti-war movement and stuff, I've got to be honest, within the left, I think it's been completely wrong. I don't think it's been effective at all. What we should have really been doing is looking to what people should have been doing is looking to ally themselves with people who are actually working in the military, because people in the military actually are really, really economically left wing. They live as communists, just don't seem to realise it. And what you find is that loads of stuff's been privatised, the food's got contracted out, and now that lad's got to pay for 3 square meals a day and lasses. The actual fleets of vehicles that were used for the engineers for a plant for digging, big trucks and it was your cranes and all that sort of stuff. That all got sold off onto a PFI scheme. So you have to rent that back. And all this stuff was in house, and it was you're getting paid for, and the army was bigger, but you weren't paying the kickbacks that you do on private finance that you do anyway. So this has all been done. It's all been eroded on the inside for years. What really is the issue is that we've had the mental health services cut and then basically outsourced to charity. We haven't got a proper health service for veterans. There's no proper community support really, or not on a national level. I mean, Liverpool's very good, and our local authority is actually very good, but it's not widely advertised because it's not a nationally advertised thing. What I will say is that basically if you want to remove the profit from war, you can't stop profit-driven wars if the weapons companies and the military are heavily privatized. I don't know how you're going to lobby for defense diversification, nuclear disarmament, if the weapons industry is privately owned and profit-driven. And how are you going to campaign and lobby against private enterprise in the military, improved social health care support, including stuff like the domestic violence services, the prison system, because this all ties into the failings of people that leave the military. You can't do that unless you unionize the military. That's never going to happen unless you unionize the military. You're never going to unionize the military unless you have political support. And unless there's representation within the political parties for veterans and their families, you're never going to get anywhere near getting political support to get to lobby for a union. Because if it was unionized, believe me, you wouldn't have the private sector anywhere near the military. And I mean that. It is not liked. It is not liked because it takes guys' jobs away from them.
It sounds a radical.
In a war years ago, he'd be working the stores.
It sounds a radical proposal, Dave, but I understand that a number of armies, military services in other countries are indeed unionised. Is that true? Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, people watching this might think that sounds like a very sort of radical proposal that is just kind of some sort of lefty ideal that is just not practical. But in reality, it's already happening. That's the case, isn't it? Do you say it was in Germany though? The military there are union?
Well, I mean, yeah, they have a federation, so they can't strike.
No,
but it's like if they have a problem with a contract or something, it's like they have a dial straight to Parliament. It's integrated in that sense.
Yeah. I wonder if I just perhaps bring Hilary just in. Let me just bring Hilary in because I mean another aspect to this, Hilary, is the value of the arms trade. I mean, there's obviously what we do as a nation in terms of the funding for the military, and I think we're due to spend on defence expenditure about £53 billion by the end of March next year. But I was just looking at this document, and if you can see it, it's the UK Defence and Security Export Statistics, latest one produced, which apparently suggests that Britain is once again the second biggest arms manufacturer anywhere in the world. And I understand that 80% of our arms export go to the Middle East, which is an incredibly, unstable region in the world. And I guess the cynic in me would suggest that the military industrial complex, the corporations that profit from arms sales, would want that instability to continue in perpetuity because it tends to promote profits for them, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, I'm sure Kate could say more about the sort of geopolitics of it, but I mean, I think that that Dave is right that without public ownership of these companies, defence diversification is very difficult. But I would say, partly in response to what you're saying about the importance of defence spending, that the government, if there's the political will, and this is a political issue, not even though the role of the unions is crucial, it's a political decision finally that needs to be in collaboration with the unions. But I mean, in a way, if the government of the day is committed to defence diversification, is committed to winding down the military industrial complex, then that means that those huge orders are no longer, going to be there. And in fact, the resources behind those orders would be diverted to, let's say, the health system. So in a way, government has a power through its, if you like, its procurement systems that can at least be a lever for diversification that can then lead to steps towards public ownership. So, I mean, I think as in any of these radical measures, there has to be a kind of transitional strategy. But I think we shouldn't forget the massive spending. I mean, it's also very profitable because, I think this is still the case, but the contracts with between the government and private companies for military products is on the basis of cost plus. So it's the cost plus a guaranteed profit. Well, who's going to not want that? And so, in a way, the government, even if the companies are still private, the government has a lot of power over those companies. And that can be both a lever for diversification and a kind of basis for a move towards public ownership.
Isn't the problem, though, Kate, that the people who sit in the Houses of Parliament, the so-called democratic representatives, are not particularly, in my opinion anyway, representing the interests of the wider general public, are they? They seem to be more interested in representing the interests of these corporations, these corporations that benefit from the arms trade. It's an incredibly lucrative industry, isn't it? What can we do? What can CND do? What is CND doing, for that matter? I mean, it recently celebrated its 60th anniversary. It's never been, more necessary, I think, today than it is today for the CND to be, promoting peace and defence diversification and so on. But what's CND doing to try and win the hearts and minds, to try and ensure that, the electorate hold the politicians in the Houses of Parliament feet to the fire to make sure that they actually represent our best interests?
Well, as you'll remember from when you were a member of Parliament, Chris, we do an enormous amount of parliamentary lobbying. We do a whole range of other activities. We do direct action, non-violent direct action. We do work at bases. We have demonstrations and all kinds of, very diverse range of activities, street stalls, work in schools. But we do have an orientation towards our parliamentary representatives because they're supposed to serve our best interests. And since the pandemic has started, we've had a big lobbying campaign to say, wash your hands of Trident. In other words, slight pun on the COVID thing. But Trident nuclear weapons, that's our nuclear weapons system. The new replacement that they're building is going to cost £205 billion over its lifetime. That's a massive amount of money. And when you think what you could spend that on instead, I mean, other very pressing security matters, not only homes and schools and those sorts of things, but what about addressing the biggest security problem, which is the health problem, the pandemics? They're not going to go away because of the way that agribusiness and destruction of the natural habitats and so on have made us vulnerable to new so-called zoonotic diseases, the crossover diseases from animals into human beings. That is not going to go away. So we need massive investment for our security, for our public health security. Then the spending to protect us from climate catastrophe. That is a massive security issue. So we need from our representatives a reprioritization what security actually is and where the money needs to go. So the thing about government spending on so-called defence, in other words, war fighting capacity, the figure I had for this year's budget, I think, was, in the region of £40 billion. Now, that is money which the government then spends on things like nuclear weapons, or aircraft carriers. It's not. Well, that is just money that it allocates to that. It can allocate that to other things, and that's what we have to press for. Because otherwise we're going to end up with weapons of mass destruction that we can't use, or it's always been said we can't use. They will then be pressed into service of NATO because control and is assigned to NATO for those. And before we know where we are, they'll be pressed into service by President Trump in one of his developing global military security initiatives. China is the latest.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because that's the latest sort of area where there is the potential for a hot war to develop. I mean, China is surrounded, isn't it, by US bases and so on, and the rhetoric is getting increasingly bellicose on both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed on both sides of the chamber of the House of Commons. I mean, these are worrying times. Does it fill you with any trepidation about where we're heading on that?
Oh, absolutely, very, very much so. We've seen our own government's attitude over the last couple of decades towards wars. We very unfortunately saw ourselves taken into the war on Iraq, the illegal war on Iraq, in the prime ministership of Tony Blair. So we've seen that, and we saw very much how the relationship with the United States led that decision by our Prime Minister to go to war on Iraq. He was like the kind of poodle coming up behind President Bush, as then was at the time. No doubt he was thinking, well, this can be good business for Britain as well, because we can go and bomb cities, bomb industries, bomb installations, and then our companies can be paid by the Iraqis to rebuild them. So there's that whole set of stuff. But our so-called special relationship with the United States continues. And because of Britain ending its relationship, its financial and trading and all those, special relationship with Europe, it's putting us further into the pockets of the US and the US administration. We've seen how they, our own government now is, rushing up behind with the Huawei thing, saying, oh, yes, we'll do what you say, Mr. Trump, and all that sort of thing. And the danger is that we will be dragged further and further into Trump's terrible, terrible schemes. I mean, we've seen within the United States the myriad disastrous policies against immigrants, against the African American population, all kinds of, against women, against lesbian and gay community, trans community, everything, the disaster that is Trump. But at the same time as those things, there's a kind of military disaster that is Trump. And I don't know if you been aware of his policies that he's been developing. A couple of years ago, that he had a new nuclear posture review. Well, we know they've got a massive nuclear arsenal, thousands of weapons that could destroy the world many times over. But he came up with this bright idea. This is the guy when he was actually running for president who said, well, why can't we use nuclear weapons? Well, now he's developed and deployed so-called usable nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a disaster waiting to happen.
Reminds me of Ronald Reagan and his neutron bomb and so on, wasn't it?
Yeah,
battlefield.
We stopped that. We stopped the neutron bomb. I mean, that was David was mentioning capitalism earlier on. That was the joke at the time. It wasn't really funny. Was that was the perfect capitalist bomb, because it actually didn't destroy buildings and property. It just killed people with radiation poisoning. So, but fortunately, the movement at that time, this is where I think I know this is close to your heart, Chris, the importance of the movement and, mass mobilization and mass action to prevent these terrible things happening. Because with Trump, with his usable nuclear weapons, his whole orientation now towards conflict with Russia and China in particular, because he's angry about the kind of big economic surge of China. He wants the US to remain top dog when it's actually a failing economy. Big global economic dynamics as well as political dynamics. We have to be really alert to that and make sure our government doesn't drag us down that terrible path. We need dialogue with China and cooperation with China. If we have any concerns about what happens there, we should be raising them through dialogue and diplomacy, not thinking about a war.
No, indeed. And I think, David, this is an area where I think your experience and people like yourself in the Veterans for Peace movement will be potentially pivotal, I think, in this notion of winning hearts and minds, because, people hear these experts on the TV and so on. But I mean, people like yourself who've been on the front line, who've actually, experienced military conflict, who are now coming forward with an argument for peace and an alternative, I think is going to be really, very important. What could you do? What would you say? I mean, to sort of kind of buttress what Kate was saying there about the importance of winning hearts and minds and campaign, because, the politicians seem to be going in the wrong direction at the moment. I mean, we had Jeremy Corbyn, who was obviously a strong kind of peace activist in that sense. Had, I think, a kind of very kind of straightforward and common sense sensible approach really to defense and military expenditure, and certainly opposed to imperialist wars. But I think hearing from people like yourself, veterans, they were very instrumental. The Vietnam veterans, for example, I think in turning public opinion in the States at the end of the 60s into the early 70s. So what's your thoughts on that point, David?
I think that, like, in terms of like veterans and what our part is to play in, like, well, I suppose in politics and that, I'm going to be blunt. You wouldn't have an NHS if it weren't for veterans or people like me. Wouldn't be there. The fear of people like me coming back en masse to poverty, wanting things. We voted Attlee in. Attlee was a veteran. Attlee was one of ours. So it's like we've been cut out over the years, to be fair. And like, whereas like the state has pit us against the working class, which it has done again and again. It's like you have people like Jack Jones, the trade unionist. He was a veteran. We've got like Tony Benn was politicized by the military. As like we don't have any representation. No one's talking to us. I mean, it's all right giving us a manifesto, say, "Oh, we'll give you this thing from the top down and in a liberal paternalistic way." Where's our engagement? Where's our representation? If we're like, I mean, we're estimated to be like about 1 in 11 of the population, and it dips because they don't really want to track us, because they don't want to track our suicide rates. They don't want to track, the fact. Well, I mean, we estimate that like about 1 in 10 people in the prison system are veterans. They don't want to track that, and what it is that I don't think one of the reasons why they don't want us being represented as a demographic within the left is because if we were to we probably become a dominant force in it, to be fair. I think you have a lot of like student politicians who are careerists who are scared of people like me, simply because like, we can talk in articulate, practical ways. I was an engineer. I can talk to you about roads and airfields and stuff, but I can also talk to you about mental health issues, security issues, logistics. Our military right now, I think the infantry is obsolete as it stands. I think the infantry should be merged with the engineers. I think, it takes 8 weeks to train a combat engineer and say like another 20 odd weeks to train an infantry. But a combat engineer can build bridges. They have basic construction techniques. They can do minefield clearance. They can do water supplies. They can like use water pumps to make potable water. We can use like boats and stuff like that. All stuff that's excellent for disaster relief. And that's what we should be, and that's how I think we should be purposed as a secure disaster relief organisation. We should be trained better I mean, we should have been used in the pandemic from the offset. We have advanced medical skills. I mean, I can do sucker chest wounds and catastrophic amputations. We have people who do minor levels of surgery with a few weeks training. We could have been trained to like clean the hospitals. We could have basically subbed done deliveries for Tesco's, do you know what I mean? I literally done instead of having food banks with some nan, giving a few donated tins of beans out of the car. The local authorities should have been getting the reservists and in the military running aid stations, checking on the vulnerable. We have training in chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear warfare. I argued against the early day motion, Luciana Berger, because she started putting out the thing of the Skripal affair and this, that, and the other. And it's like, well, I know how nerve agents work, right? And they were talking about a nerve agent that's really like 3 times more powerful than the green stuff off the rock. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, if anybody would have touched Novichok, they'd be dead.
Yeah.
So I argued against, it needed more investigation. Because you're looking at like World War III. Now, I argued against Luciana Berger as somebody who did like over 10 years in the army. She argued against me as who's been in the student union.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And the thing is that the MP is full of these student union people who've never actually been hungry, never felt fear, never felt pain. Do you know what I mean? Never seen real suffering. And we are everywhere. We are everywhere.
Hilary, just on that point that David is making there, a passionate point there. I mean, it strikes me that there's scope, and this might be happening anyway, but I mean, and indeed Kate for that matter, for there to be some, collaboration, really, a hookup between, the work that people in Dave's organisation is doing and work that you're doing, Hilary, in terms of defence diversification, and obviously CND's campaign. Bringing people together, that whole kind of labour movement maxim about unity of strength. It seems, rather than ploughing individual furrows, although that will be necessary to some extent, but where there's scope for collaboration, is there scope, do you think, Hilary, for
as David was talking, I thought, wow, to be honest, I have learned just now. I'd not thought you don't tend to recognise how diverse the skills are of veterans and how important a resource they are. So, I must get David's, details and get him to write an article to make this more public, because I think, there's now a new generation of ex-students, who are not careerists, who are very engaged and wanting to think about alternatives, and who would be really open to collaboration. And I think we've got to, on the defence diversification side, we've got to kind of expand our sort of vision and our strategic alliances to include veterans. So I think, if maybe Kate should come in here, but maybe CND could post the pandemic. Well, it won't be post for a long time, but as the pandemic, declines and we've got a bit more time and possibility to meet up, maybe it'd be good to have some sort of very practical workshop on, with Chris too, on what next for defence diversification, which would include the question of the veterans and also include the key point, which I think Kate has hinted at, which is that, in a way, defence diversification has got to be part of the Green New Deal. There's a very good organisation called Green New Deal Plus, and that is really saying, look, the arms industry is a crucial part of the problem. It's a massive consumer of, massive producer of high carbon emissions, user of oil and so on. And so I think now is the moment, particularly learning from, the opportunities that have arisen during the COVID crisis, to look again at the issue. I think also, just a final point, I think in a way we can see the front line of the COVID crisis as kind of veterans in a way. They're kind of equivalent to David and the war veterans, because they've been at the front line. They've been radicalized. Just that same phenomenon that David's described with the veterans after the war.
Yeah.
It's different, but it's evident that, health workers have been radicalized and their relationship to communities has been radicalized. So I think they'd be up for a much more campaigning approach to the expansion of the health service as part of, restructuring the economy away from military and for a low carbon economy. So I think there are a lot of new alliances there, which would include with the veterans. So I think we should move forward from this. We should build this seminar, which has been really good, as into the basis of a now kind of like working kind of event that Kate and Chris could, with David.
Yeah, well, as you probably know, Hilary, I'm involved with a number of people, and we're trying to sort of build a kind of a new grassroots movement, the resistance movement, and we were planning, in fact, to launch at a Festival of Resistance last month, a 2-day weekend event with a series of plenary sessions and workshops. And one of the areas that we wanted to explicitly cover was this agenda that we've been talking about this evening. But of course, it can't just be one meeting. Obviously, together is the first step, as it were. We've then got to kind of, as it were, go on and take that kind of learning, that shared thinking out to the wider general public, because it's no good talking to ourselves. We've got to kind of win the hearts and minds of the wider general public, because I've been frustrated. I'm sure we're all frustrated at the lack of progress towards a more peaceful world, and the the bellicose rhetoric that we're getting on both sides of the chamber now in the House of Commons is really, really troubling, I think. But Kate, have you got any? Oh, and by the way, I think Hilary, you've got to shoot off, haven't you, soon? So
I'll just listen to Kate, and then I better.
Well, thank you anyway. I mean, if people are just wondering that if Hilary's not here anymore, she's got another Zoom meeting that she's got. Everybody's zoomed out these days. But anyway, so thank you if you have to shoot off before I get the chance to thank you for coming on. But and let's make sure we do share details. But Kate, just coming in on that point, just developing that a little, perhaps, about how, is there scope, do you think, for the kind of collaboration that Hilary was just talking about there from CND's point of view?
Absolutely. I mean, CND is very committed to working in alliances. It's part of our strategy, and what we don't want is a situation where nuclear weapons are seen as it's some kind of separate box over there. It's a kind of bad tech thing. Whereas in actual fact, the whole question of nuclear weapons, it's to do with, the role of imperialism. It's to do with power and control. It's to do with threats. All those kinds of things, as well as obviously the very real danger that humanity can be destroyed. But it operates on a very, very top level thing. There are 9 countries in the world who have nuclear weapons. Everyone else doesn't have them. They don't want them. Half the world is all self-organized in nuclear weapons free zones. There's a massive global demand for nuclear weapons to be got rid of. So we work as broadly as possible across the movements. We work with, as part of the anti-war movement as well as the anti-nuclear movement. We work with health campaigns, keep our NHS public, and anti-austerity campaigns. All these things are linked in together, anti-poverty, for justice, all those things. We've been active around Palestine, the questions of the Middle East. Many people say, no justice, no peace. That's a very popular slogan, obviously, and we very strongly feel that. So we want to be part of wider movements and wider alliances. And I think in terms of what you were saying about, I think Hilary was talking maybe about some kind of working group taking these issues forward. And I'm perfectly happy if it's initiated, Chris, from the work that you're doing with movements of resistance and so on, whoever's initiating it, it's good. We need to have that debate. We need to have that dialogue. But I'm for not just having a debate and a dialogue. I'm for some practical action, because what we've learned from the pandemic is so many people say, there can be no going back to the world how it was before.
No.
Probably get the majority of people thinking that, but what's happening? It's going back to that. There will be very many big differences, mostly in terms of where we can't go and the jobs we can't have anymore. But there has to be that sense of progress, of solidarity, of radicalisation that Hilary was talking about. We got to try and build on that and not let the government take everything back to the way they wanted it before. So if this discussion can be taken forward in a practical way, working with veterans such as David, people like Hilary with the expertise and also the kind of media range and your movement as well, then I think that would be a really good development. We can maybe make it international, because CND's got a huge number of international contacts and links with wider movements.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I mean, I was doing some series of speaking sessions for CND, not long after Jeremy had been elected, because there was a debate. If you remember, in the 2015 Labour Party conference, there was a debate about Trident, and I don't think the question got put in the end, and so the next year was spent going around speaking at different meetings, constituency Labour Party meetings, and so on. Just in relation to that, what support there was. I mean, and I've got to say, at every meeting I attended, there was overwhelming support. But what was interesting was, and the point I was just going to ask you to perhaps say a little bit more about, Kate, is when I was looking into this, I mean, it's interesting. There are what a lot of people probably think is unusual suspects who are very kind of opposed to, nuclear weapons. I mean, on a whole host of different, not just the cost, but just the effectiveness of it. The advent of new technology means that the submarines are no longer invisible, as it were, under the sea and so on. But there's very senior military personnel that I came across who were opposed to it. People even in the Tory party opposed. But was also significant was I think it was about 100. Well, you'll know this figure probably better than me, but it was about 140, 150, I think, nations around the world have sort of signed some sort of anti-nuclear pledge from memory. But I wonder if you could maybe unpack that a little bit and just give a little bit of background on that one as well, Kate, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, just in terms of like not the usual suspects, you're absolutely right. And David probably is aware of this as well. Very senior military figures, mostly when they're retired, I should say. But people who've been like generals, field marshals, they've written to the Times and done all kinds of big statements saying, Trident should be scrapped. They say it's militarily useless. It's just a kind of political posture about Britain's status in the world. Basically, and they would like the money to be spent on other things, including veterans' needs. That's absolutely fundamental. So there's people like that. There's also, you may remember Des Brown, Chris. He was the Labour Defence Secretary in the time of the first time Trident replacement came to Parliament in 2007. He was there pushing away, so we've got to have this. And then subsequently, he's really in the forefront of saying, actually, new technology is developed to the state now, where even if Trident comes on stream, it will already be redundant. It will be obsolete because there's so many developments in things like underwater drone technology, and not to mention computer hacking and all that kind of stuff. It'll be knocked out before it's even out of the berth virtually. He championed it, and now he's against it. So attitudes have changed. But in terms of attitudes, if you look at public opinion polls, which have been in their majority against Trident, for a variety of reasons, including, what you could spend the money on instead. If you look at the demographic breakdown of that, overwhelmingly young people are completely opposed to nuclear weapons. They just can't see the sense of it. It's like, well, that's crazy. Who would want a nuclear weapon? So it's like partly a generational thing. Older people caught up in Cold War rhetoric. That's why we don't want to return to Cold War rhetoric around places like China, because that just takes people down a complete dead end. And as you say, the majority of states in the world support the introduction, which is now at the United Nations, a new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Chemical and biological weapons, they're outlawed. Nuclear weapons should be outlawed too. So it's like this, going back to this very small number of very powerful countries holding the whole world over a barrel over nuclear weapons. And
if anything, Kate, I would suggest that it's even more imperative that we, as a world, outlaw nuclear weapons, because in the event of a thermonuclear exchange, it's the end of the world. I mean, obviously, chemical and biological weapons are appalling, but that can be contained to a certain extent. I mean, absolutely disgusting, and I'm absolutely delighted, obviously, that they are banned. But a nuclear war could literally mean a nuclear winter and the end of the world. We've only got 5 minutes left, and it's been very remiss of me because I've not brought in any questions from the public, because the discussion has been very absorbing, and so apologies for that. But let me just try and get a couple of questions in from the public, if I may. Somebody's asking, this is one for you, David, actually. They're asking if I could ask you, where do we start in getting political and union representation for veterans and the armed forces and their families? Where do we start with that, Dave?
I have a model motion that's been kicking around for a while, and up until COVID, the majority, I think it was pretty much all the constituency Labour parties in Liverpool were going to push it. So that was like where they're going. I know that like the Northwest Regional Board for Labour was looking to, the Northwest Regional Party was looking to push the motion as well. I was speaking to Labour Friends of the Forces the other day and asking them about it. Basically what it is that I have friends in other political parties in the left, but I've got friends who are conservatives as well. And I think that, like, unless, you push, I don't care if somebody who's conservative takes my motion and then pushes it to their party, or if someone's Lib Dem does that. Because the bottom line is that we need to be in a conversation if you're going to talk about defence. And it's not good enough that you have somebody who's an officer, who has an agenda, who has been schooled in a certain way, who isn't from the working class. Not some of them are, but I'm just saying that a motion already exists. If you want to share it, you can share it.
Is that motion, could that motion be put at a trade union branch meeting as well, for example? Or is it geared explicitly for the Labour Party? And I wonder, could it be adapted perhaps to be passed at the union branch?
It could be adapted, yeah. It's a model motion. I do not care if someone just like takes the word Labour out and then shoves in right or whatever. Doesn't matter to me. Use the motion. Stick your own name on it.
Community organisations and things like that, potentially pass it. Then we could even maybe get the Women's Institute on side, perhaps, then on something like this. Because I think if we can build a broad-based campaign,
all day.
Yeah, that's something. Then, and perhaps one thing that we can try and do then is if we could maybe get a copy of that, and when we put this this debate that we had this evening out on social media, if we could maybe attach a link. If one's available to the motion, and encourage more people to take it to their own local political party or trade union branch or community organisation. We've probably got time for one more question, and I'll try and come to both of you, but perhaps go to Kate in the first instance. This one's from Mark Anderson. He's saying the UK and the US Armed Forces have been in Afghanistan for 19 years now. What will it take for most people here to care about bringing them home? I think there's an issue really, but there seems to be a kind of, a lack of awareness of people are not sufficiently motivated to be pressing politicians about that. What do you think? What will it take, Kate? Do you think? Well,
I think that most people don't know that they're still there. I think that they were very much aware of the war on Afghanistan, at the time of the Twin Towers, that was when the response to that terrorist attack was to go and attack a country, with millions of innocent civilians and, completely disastrous policy. I think people think that was in the past, and that those soldiers, the personnel, forces personnel, are no longer there. And I think to really raise that issue in terms of public awareness, really fight for it in Parliament. Although I know it's like the US's longest war and that people are still there, I myself don't know how many British personnel are there, and that's a big lamentable ignorance on my part. I'm ashamed of that, but we really need to be raising the profile of that issue.
Yeah. We probably will get one more question in. And I've just been told that that motion's been posted now, Dave. So we've been
on that quickly
on our site. Say again. Yeah, that's been out there. Sorry, I thought you wanted to come in there. Let me just go.
Can I come in quickly on that?
Oh yes, you can. Sorry. Yes, of course. Yeah.
These wars, right? No, sorry. These wars, right? These wars make money. Right, the wars don't have to win. If the wars are never ending, that's better, because the weapons industry is privately owned and profit driven, right? And to be honest, the privatization of the weapons industry, it makes us weak as a country. Our weapons have been substandard because it's been about putting something out and then leaving it a bit crap so you can put an upgrade later and improve on your contract. We've had it with body armor, we've had it with the assault weapon, we've had it with various bits of kit. So, and I'm just going to say that, in terms of nukes are a terrible weapon, right? Because you can't do anything with them, they're pointless and they cost a lot of money. We're better off spending our money on directed energy weapons to defend against nukes, if you're talking about nuclear defense, to be fair,
And just finally, and we've literally only got about 30 seconds, Kate. This one's from Jack Thomas saying, some people think Britain's nuclear policy is one of no first use. It isn't, says Jack. How can we get the public to realise that we could be a nuclear aggressor and use nuclear weapons in an attack? A brief response to that, Kate?
Yeah, well, he's absolutely right. We're part of NATO. Our nuclear weapons are assigned to NATO, and NATO has a first use policy, and that will be driven by the US. So our nukes could be used in a hostile attack on someone else, and we would have no control over it.
No. Well, listen, we've run out of time, and I want to thank Hilary, Kate, and David for a really interesting conversation this evening. And hopefully we've made the first step towards bringing these different threads together and getting these different kind of campaign groups working in collaboration, which will hopefully make them all even more effective. So thanks to everybody for tuning in this evening. Next week, we're going to be talking to John Atherton about the importance of the cooperative movement and how we can build local cooperatives. One of the things that was contained in the Labour Party manifesto in 2017, I think it was in the 2019 manifesto too, was this notion of bringing about an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power by the creation of more worker cooperatives and giving workers the opportunity to buy out their companies when they're up for sale. And one of the things that we're looking at doing as a resistance movement is helping and encouraging through working with trade unionists and community groups to build their own worker cooperatives. So tune in next week at the same time when we'll be speaking to Jonathan. I think it should be another fascinating edition of Resistance TV. So thanks again for watching this evening, and good night.